You're listening to the No Gray Areas podcast with Patrick McCullough. Today's guest is Dr. Angela Hu Howard, Oxford grad and international law fellow at Beckett Law Firm. She breaks down the importance of having diversity and religious freedom. Let's dive in.
So, Angela, you might be the smartest person that I've had on this podcast because you went to law school at Harvard. You got your PhD from Oxford, correct?
Yep. Well, I might be the guest with the most number of letters behind her name, but without question, because I know your podcast and have listened to it, not going to be the smartest person here. Certainly not the one with the most wisdom.
Yeah. Well, you do have a lot of letters behind your name. So, but that just shows tenacity and grit and perseverance.
You know, that's what it was about. It was about not quitting, because it was some of that, especially the last degree, the DPhil, the PhD, was the hardest thing I'd ever done. And I wasn't very good at it. I mean, and I'm not, this isn't false modesty speaking. I just had so many friends and colleagues who were so much more talented at doing legal philosophy than I was. Yeah. But I think God wouldn't let me quit.
Yeah.
And now I tell people who are struggling through their PhD, the only thing I've got for you is just don't quit. Yeah. You just keep doing it, what you need to do in front of you every day. And that's it. So it actually was, it was tenacity a lot more than intelligence.
Well, I'll tell you what, though, that's pretty good advice for all of our listeners and for me as well. Just don't quit.
For life.
For life.
Yeah,
Grit,
don't quit.
Tenacity. And so, well, congratulations on that. I think you just, you got, that was last year?
Just about a year ago,
Yeah. What was your dissertation on?
Oh, so I'm in the field of legal theory, and I wrote about religious exceptions as an example, or just kind of a very specific area of study in a broader conversation about what makes a good rule.
What makes a good rule?
Yeah, and what good governance looks like. Yeah.
Because I emailed you and I was like, hey, we should talk about your dissertation.
Yeah.
And you said, I don't know that people would be that interested in it. I would like to unpack that at some point. We won't do it today, but I would like to unpack that at some point. But just briefly, how do you write a whole dissertation on what makes a good rule? I'm sure a lot of the audience is like, I never even thought about that.
We have all thought about it. We just don't describe it that way, right? So every time you, as a employer, as a parent, as a friend with appropriate boundaries, you're acting according to a rule. You're thinking about, you're using a combination of principle and prudence to make decisions. Your values are coming into it. The practical aspects of your life are coming into it, what you can handle and what you can't, what's right and wrong. We make rules that govern our lives all day long.
Yeah, we do.
And people who, and you especially, I think, see this in parenthood, because every day you're thinking through the kind of rules that your children are going to follow. And it's not
and
that you have
usually pushing back a little bit too, aren't they?
They are.
Yes.
They're testing the limits, and it's actually so good for our thinking to be tested. Because there are many times when my daughter will say, I want to do something else, and because of X, Y, and Z. And she's 9 and has become quite persuasive.
Yes.
And I'd say about half the time I listen to her, I realize there's something I didn't think about, and, we can modify that. We can change that. We can, and then there are other times when that's not going to work for the family rhythm, or that's not going to be good for you. That's not in your best interests. But so I think we're exercising that skill all the time, but we don't necessarily think of it that way. And we don't necessarily think of our public square as being a set of rules that needs to be kind of properly enacted. And we get it's especially with sort of culture war issues, we get caught up in stories that matter, but we kind of forget what the contours should be, for living together in harmony, even though we have all of this disagreement. And what you do in the home, in your personal life, what you do in your company that you're running, that's just what our lawmakers are doing at a much grander scale. So I found it interesting enough to stick with it I must have broken a record at Oxford, at my university, for how long it took me. But I found it interesting the whole time. I sort of joke that nobody else wants to hear about it because it was quite boring at some level. And one of my supervisors used to say that the title of your dissertation, and I probably don't barely remember it at this point, so don't ask me.
Okay, I will not ask that question.
The title of your dissertation should be so boring that nobody would ever pick that book up in a bookstore.
Really?
Yeah, he was trying to focus us.
Did you succeed at that?
It's pretty
probably
boring.
because you don't
pretty
even
boring
remember.
title.
Yeah,
long and boring. Yeah.
But Angela, I find that a fascinating subject. Though I know you're saying it's maybe a little boring to most people, but what makes a good rule? It's something that we've been asking since we were kids. We just didn't realize it, like you're saying.
Yes.
And as adults or as lawmakers, as parents, as friends, people in marriages, those are all questions we should be asking, right? Like we have this boundary. Is this a good boundary? What makes it a good boundary? Should we move the boundary a little bit? Those are legitimate questions. Right.
And we're doing that. We're doing that all day long. And we're doing that when we're driving and thinking about traffic rules and whether they make sense. And, like 99% of them make sense. It's amazing to me. When I see systems that work, I get very excited because so much work and so many people went into designing this thing. And when it works, it's a thing of beauty. It kind of shows us that we can figure things out if we have kind of the proper foundation for that conversation.
As kids, we all dreamed of being in a society or a home or a culture where there were no rules. But if you think about it very long at all, philosophically, that is maybe a picture of hell. It is not a pretty picture to think of a culture, society, or anything without rules, right?
I mean, it's a circle of hell to be governed by your passions.
Yeah.
So
you are
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go.
Governed, like ruled, actually, by your passions.
Yeah. Well, we're both people of faith, and so we know that we have a God who, again, we want to kick against some of those rules or those guidelines that He's put in our lives, but they're there for a reason, especially when we realize He's good.
Right.
He's a good God. So. Yeah, and parenting is the same thing. I remember being a kid and hating some of the rules that my parents had, and guess what rules I had for my kids? Most of the same ones. Because you find out there's a reason for them. Yeah. Okay, so you're currently working for who?
I work for Beckett.
Okay.
And it's a little law firm based out of Washington, D.C. We defend people of all faiths. We only do religious freedom work. We do what we call impact litigation. So we're looking mainly at kind of law-making cases that are law-changing cases that are going to have a pretty broad impact, set precedent, good precedent, hopefully. So a lot of our work is in appellate courts, in courts of appeal, and at the Supreme Court.
Now, you said a couple of things in there that I think are really good. We got to unpack a little bit. You said you defend people of all faiths.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Why is that important?
One, it's the right thing to do. So our founder, Seamus Hassan, is a deeply believing Catholic, and he based the Beckett Fund on a Vatican II document called Dignitatis Humanae, and it was a statement on religious freedom from the Catholic Church, and it laid out why religious freedom was important from a Catholic perspective. And it argued from reason why religious freedom should apply to people of all faiths, even if they did not agree with Catholic doctrine, which the Catholic Church would defend as being actually theologically correct. So the argument isn't that there isn't a truth or there isn't a right answer, or that the inquiry for that isn't important and the pursuit of the truth isn't important, but rather that everybody does have a God-given right to pursue it in the manner that their conscience directs. So those are the roots. And I agree with Dignitatis Humanae's argument. But there are many practical reasons too. I mean, I think that it's essential to making our country, our republic, our world a place where people can pursue the God-given desire to follow their conscience, to ask questions about what is true and what is not, about who we are. So Seamus is sort of fond of saying, well, we don't all agree about who God is, but we do all agree about who we are. We are people who have inherent dignity. We are people who care about the truth. We're people who want to be guided by our conscience. And even when we don't want to be guided by our conscience because it's inconveniently telling us to do or not do things that we don't or do want to do, there is that voice that kind of tells you whether to go right or to go left, right? And, there are other practical reasons too. I think it keeps us honest as lawyers. So we're not only defending, Christians or Hindus or Muslims or Jews or Sikhs. I'm now going down the alphabet of people. We sort of say our clients have faith from A to Z. Like there's Amish through the Zoroastrians. And we defend people.
Is that Z one a real one?
Yes,
is it really? I didn't know that. You just taught me. So there really is A to Z religions.
I've learned so much about different religions.
Yeah,
in this job.
Well,
but it keeps us honest because we can't. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
I'm
interviewing you, so you get to go whatever you want.
Well, I mean, because we can't only defend one client, right? When we advocate for a rule change, when we argue a case, we have to think, is this going to be good for everybody? Yeah. So I kind of like that. That's what we have to do.
Well, and I'm glad that you went on because what you said there at the end is so important, right? Because someone might be listening who maybe isn't of any religious background. They may go, well, it doesn't really matter to me.
Right.
Why does it matter?
Yeah.
But you would, I'm assuming, argue that it doesn't. It should matter to everybody that you're fighting for religious freedom. Why should it matter to everybody?
Oh,
it's a whole nother dissertation you could write.
I think people have written books about it.
Yeah.
I think that it goes back to this idea that we know who we are, right? And that we know who others are. And I think a lot of our private and public lives are sorting through that and finding the best way to respond to that knowledge. And I think that that's true even if you don't believe in a transcendental being, if you don't believe in God, and you want to have the freedom to pursue that call. So I think it's a really inherent part of being human to do that. And we actually do have atheists and agnostics who support our work and are strong supporters. They don't have very strong faith or even sometimes any on their own, but they see the value of what we're doing because we're fighting for diversity in the public square. And our founder actually wrote a book with this title, For the Right to Be Wrong, right? Within certain boundaries. So, it's wrong to murder people. There's really no... There are certain bright lines that we draw. This isn't a sort of, there's no boundaries. But we certainly want the right to be wrong in our public discourse, in our debate, so that we can be persuaded, so that we can persuade others. And religious freedom is a really integral part of it. It pulls in a lot of other freedoms that people don't always think about when they think about religious freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, to act as a church. We're sitting in a studio house within a church right now, and to collectively act. Freedom of the press, to print Bibles. I mean, these are all...
They're all tied together.
They're actually all intimately tied together.
And isn't it true when we look back through history, it never really goes well when we start taking away the freedom of religion, right? Like we see it time and again. That doesn't end well.
Yeah, it doesn't. And we continue to make mistakes today. So I started at Beckett actually doing almost all international work. So almost all international cases in other countries and other jurisdictions. My work is a little bit more kind of academic now. So I'm doing more sort of tying philosophy and practice, our cases in theory, because I happen to have done this, philosophy, legal philosophy degree, and focused mostly on domestic work, although I do still do some international. But when I was doing more work abroad and lecturing and doing a certain amount of training in other countries, particularly in countries that had jurisdictions that were just starting to either had been more recently formed. So we've been fighting about religion and religious freedom for, 200 50 years. I mean,
in this
a
country.
long time. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, not as long as England has been doing it, but a long time versus constitutional democracies around the world that were formed primarily after World War II and modeled their societies on kind of post-World War II Universal Declaration of Human Rights that came out of the UN and, kind of adopted our legal system of balancing rights, for example, and declaring that these are rights. But then you have to negotiate them. You have to say, when do they apply? When do they not? What are the boundaries, right? And a lot of times there was sometimes this feeling of, are you an American just lecturing me about the right way to do this? And I can easily say we're sharing our struggles with you because we've been arguing about this for a really long time.
Yes.
And what I can offer is not to tell you exactly what to do or that we're better, but just, I have to speak from an American perspective because I'm American. I don't have, there's not another nationality from which I can, but I can tell you the mistakes that we made, and we've made a lot of them.
Yes.
We've made a lot of them. And the founding of our country began with those mistakes. And I think our founders were reacting to it, right?
Yes.
I mean, they came here looking for a lot of things. And one of the key things was religious freedom. And then many of them repeated the mistakes that they were trying to escape from. I mean, most Americans don't know that Quakerism used to be outlawed from colony to colony. I mean, they literally would drag Quakers to the borders of colonies because they dared to preach and because they would not stop preaching. Yeah. And I mean, we did things like we bore holes in their tongues, we cut off their ears, we tarred and feathered them, and they wouldn't stop, which just kind of tells you how compelling the conscience is.
Yeah.
And how people will fight for what they believe the right thing is.
Well, and it's so interesting that you're bringing this history up because you mentioned two things that are important to get. I think first of all, that our country, the U.S., was founded with this idea of religious freedom, but we haven't always done it well. Even some of those very ones that were founding it on that principle didn't always do it well.
Yeah.
Which, surprise, that's kind of being a human, right? Like, again, you and I being people of faith, we don't always live out what we claim to believe deep within our souls and our hearts, right? But you mentioned something else too. Post World War II, you said that this whole thing came out, but that was in a reaction to what we saw as a world, right? Like the whole world, the UN, most of the world got together, but it was in a reaction to what we saw happen when you took away those religious freedoms, right? Yeah.
The Holocaust, rampant anti-Semitism throughout Europe. It wasn't only in Germany, and I think we saw the devastating effects of that, and it was a reaction. I mean, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, really lists rights that.
And when did that
I think
come?
we always had.
Was that in that?
Yeah, post World War II.
Okay.
It was a reaction to World War II, but it's sort of important to recognize that all of the rights that are listed in there are kind of recognize something that was already there in it, but it was an effort to kind of unite countries around this idea and say, this is what we're going to pursue. Now, I have a lot of respect for colleagues and friends who work at the UN who really care and do great work and have a lot of integrity. I think the institution itself, like most institutions, is deeply corrupted in many ways. It's just because they're run by human beings.
Yes, yeah.
So I don't mean this to just sort of endorse everything that the UN does, which I absolutely do not.
Yeah.
But to say that as a concept, it was capturing something that I think is valuable, was valuable then, is valuable today, but more is recognizing something that was always there. And you see a lot of the marks of that in our Constitution, right? So we talk about even the way the language of the Constitution really recalls us to how we're born with inalienable rights, also in, of course, the Declaration of Independence. And but it was already there, is what I mean. Like, we're not making this up.
Yeah, this isn't something
We're recognizing who we are in Seamus's language.
You know what's so interesting is if someone had been listening to these podcasts that we've been doing for about a year now, that they will see this theme that keeps being dropped in by multiple guests, and you brought it up a couple of times, inherent dignity.
Yeah.
And that is something that's brought up often, but it's such a core, again, being people of faith, the narrative starts with showing why we should have inherent dignity, right? We're image bearers of the Creator. And so even when you and I don't agree,
Right.
you still have dignity. Even when you have a different religion, you still have dignity. Even when fill in the blank.
Even when I do bad things.
Hmm.
And this is, so we actually, it's less controversial today. It was probably more controversial when we started. But we've had a number of prisoner cases, quite a few. And in fact, one of our most recent ones, is it our most recent prisoner case? I'm not sure. At the Supreme Court is Holt v. Cobbs. And it's on behalf of a Muslim convict, a Muslim prisoner, who was in for a very serious violent crime. And we defended his right as a Muslim to grow a 1/4-inch beard, which he felt was, and most Muslims feel, is a dictate or is a requirement of the faith for Muslim men. And that decision, we won unanimously. It was a 9-0 vote. And it was a really, I think, a pretty seminal case. But we say you don't lose your rights once you get into, you lose some of your rights.
Yes.
Right? You can't travel.
Yes.
You just go wherever you want.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the religious freedom realm, you also lose some of your ability to practice your religion. He can't just go to any mosque that he wants in the country freely, the way he could before he was convicted of a crime and thrown into jail. But what we do is we minimize as much as possible government restrictions so that people can pursue their conscience. And there's actually a legal standard, a legal rule that the courts use in America to kind of capture that idea. So the rule that is most prevalent in religious freedom cases says that the government can only restrict a substantial, a religious exercise that you want to pursue that causes you a substantial burden, that puts a substantial burden on your religious exercise or, a religious act, if it satisfies 2 criteria. And one is that it has a compelling government interest. It can't just be any government interest. It has to be really compelling.
Yeah.
And 2, that it's the least restrictive means to do it, right? So the idea is that if there's another way for us to do this without restricting your religious freedom, but still accomplishing our public interest here, then you have to do it that way. And it actually, some of that really gets at what makes a good rule. Like, rules shouldn't be overbroad. You don't want to encompass too much. Rules should specifically follow a particular good, a compelling government interest. And when a substantial burden on one of somebody's fundamental constitutional rights is at stake, those things should really be acting in concert. So,
and why would you? So, I think probably a lot of the listeners might be going like, "Does it matter that much that you can grow a 1/4-inch beard?"
Yeah.
But I hear you saying it does, and it actually matters to us when you filter it down. Why is that? Like, why do you think it was important that your law firm defended that?
There's a much broader principle at stake than the 1/4-inch beard of this one man. And a lot of, sort of famous constitutional law cases get at this, right? It's a story of one person. But the personal becomes political very, very quickly because it represents a principle that we should all really care about. So it's not just about his right to grow a beard and live according to his conscience that way. We have cases having to do with access to kosher and halal food for Jewish and Muslim prisoners. One of our clients has been prison fellowship, Chuck Colson's ministry. So it's about access to, it's not just, the prisoner's access to religious texts like the Bible, the prisoner's access to being able to attend religious services, the prisoner's access to, now I'm naming things that a Christian audience would relate to a little bit more, access to being able to attend Mass and take communion, and also prison fellowship's ability to go into prisons and to do their work of rehabilitation. And they have an incredibly high rate of success, right?
They
they run really stringent programs The prisoners volunteer; they're never forced to go through. But they're also waiting on the outside when they come out, and their rate of recidivism is so much lower than prisoners who were not thinking in a conscience-driven way while they were serving their time, and who don't have communities waiting to support them when they come out. So, I mean, this is something that we should all care about.
Goes back to religious freedom, and
yes.
the dignity of
Right.
And it's so interesting again because it goes back to that core about the inherent dignity. I mean, when you start not worrying about certain populations, whether that be prisoner or color of the skin or gender or whatever, a society starts to unravel, doesn't it? I mean, that's what we've seen in history. It may not be overnight, but
you're right. So I used to sort of say, give me any country and show me any jurisdiction and show me how they treat their least favored religious minority, and I'll tell you how good they're doing, or how well they're doing, and how good and I'll tell you how good their justice system is, right? It's how we treat the least of these. And I would modify that today to a lot of other people who are very vulnerable. I mean, you can say that about the poorest people in our society. You can say that about the people who have the greatest disabilities in our society. You can say that about, people who have suffered the most racial injustice. What does it look like for them today? And it's going to tell you a lot about how we're doing. If you're well off, if you have a lot of privilege in your life, if you either came from or were adopted into or formed, a very stable family eventually, if you have been through a lot and eventually, your own story formed an incredibly strong, flourishing family. And if you're in that situation, and your litmus test or your, barometer for how the country is doing is yourself and your friends who all look and act like you, it's not accurate.
That is so.
It's not accurate.
So good for us to get.
Yeah.
That is so good for us to get, because I think that's what we naturally do as humans. Is we look and we go, well, I made it, or I'm doing okay, or it's okay, but that's not the test we need to.
And I had it really hard, and I pulled myself up by my bootstraps.
Yes.
And I'm sort of sympathetic to that, because my parents came here. They immigrated from Taiwan without really anything. My dad they just worked really, really hard.
So you grew up in a family that lived that out.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like my life has been sort of the American dream illustrated. I mean, they really came here with hardly anything. But they also did have help that we have to recognize other people don't. My father got a full scholarship to get his MBA from a school in the middle of nowhere in Missouri. And that was what he could get. And it was his kind of ticket out of a society where he didn't feel, or, a country where the socioeconomic circumstances weren't what he felt he could, where he could flourish. I mean, Taiwan looks very different now. It's one of these Asian tigers. It is flourishing in many ways. But back then it was very, very different. It was very, very poor. There was political instability. And he came here with nothing, and they worked so hard, but they had certain things, right? I mean, he had a stable marriage. My mother supported him. He had family that cared about him. He had a scholarship to go to school. He had an incredible work ethic that he picked up somewhere along the way. And he used it. So we, Catholics talk a lot about cooperating with the grace that God gave you. Just take God's grace and go, well, that should be enough. I'm just going to hang out here. You cooperate with it. And that's where faith and work really get married, right?
Yes.
And I feel like my parents did cooperate with the many gifts that they were given. But they worked really hard. And I see that because I grew up watching them work so hard and sacrifice so much for our family. And for the most part, depend on themselves. But they also had amazing employers who wanted to sponsor them as immigrants in this country. They had the scholarship, and they also had other things. They had debt, and they, the first place that they ever lived was this basement apartment in Harlem before it was gentrified, and it didn't have a full bath. So they struggled, and I see the value of that kind of grit.
Yeah.
I lament that. I feel like that's the value of grit is being lost, right? And I try to instill that in our, admittedly, I think very privileged children who haven't known a hungry day in their lives. But I also realize that we are not atomized beings. Everybody who has made it can remember, for the most part, that even if everything else was going to hell in a handbasket, am I allowed to say that?
Yes, you can. Yes.
There was that one mentor.
Yeah.
There was that one teacher who believed in them and wouldn't give up. There was there was the one advocate who, when they were popping back and forth to different foster homes that might have been abusive, was just the one constant in their lives that made them feel like they could get out of it. And I feel like our society, am I going too long?
No.
I feel like our society is losing the grip of how these things work together and how we're actually all responsible for it. So, the story of Mr. Holt wasn't just about him. Yeah. It really entailed all of the things that went into how he decided to convert to Islam. He was a convert, went into what made him start to think in moral terms. And as Christians, we don't believe what Muslims do. In fact, I think my Muslim friends and I are very comfortable saying, I think you're wrong about that. Yep. Extremely important thing that you believe, and that's a conversation worth having. But to preserve his ability to pursue that is incredibly important. And he doesn't even do it alone. Yeah. He doesn't do it alone. He does it in consort with organizations like Prison Fellowship, who are out there, thinking about him and the rest of society, about what happens to everybody else when prisoners come out. Yeah. They're thinking about the recidivism rate. They're not thinking about just one thing. Yeah. And I might just end this little rant with somebody comes to mind. Michael McConnell is a law professor at Stanford. He's a constitutional law scholar. And he talks about how liberalism is not just the government on one side and a bunch of atomized individuals on the other. There are a whole host of mediating institutions in between. There are churches and there are hospitals and there are civic centers and there are schools and there are all of these mediating institutions. And religious freedom just doesn't just cover the one individual and what you or I want to do. It also is protecting.
Which is why it's so important, isn't it?
The institutions, so that they not only can help to enact the common good, right? Yeah. But they act as mediators. Yeah. That is, they also present alternatives to state power. Yeah. It's incredibly dangerous if all we care about is state power, and power resides entirely there, and the government tells you what your rights are and what the limits are, and there's no mediating conversation there, or if individuals are so alone and powerless that they can't, in community, sometimes through these institutions, but sometimes just through some random, protest that springs up, start to say there are alternatives to this. Like the state isn't the arbiter of what God-given rights we have. It's a whole conversation.
Which is what you guys are involved in and why it should matter. I thought of this analogy when you were just talking there, and I don't know if this works really well, but the problem is sometimes when we think you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and because, your family made it, well, everyone should make it. But it's almost like taking 10 little kids that don't know how to swim and throwing them deep in the deep end of the pool. And the problem is we build our philosophy sometimes off of that one out of the 10 kids. That just figured it out and got to the side. And then we go, well, see, they did it. So, and we ignore the fact that 9 others drowned.
Yeah.
But I think I added a little bit. I've used that analogy before, but you just helped me add something to it. Religious freedom helps those organizations that will jump in and help. So sometimes one of those kids, it may be a Jewish organization that helped, and maybe it was a Muslim organization. there's a lot more to it. But our society is better because you throw 9 kids in that don't know how to swim. Right. 1 will get there on their own. Yeah. 9 would drown if they didn't have some help. Yeah. And there's a lot of organizations from different religious backgrounds that will help those other 9.
Yeah. And I think today Americans don't I think, don't understand just how much religious organizations are doing and religious ministries.
I think you're right.
And for free.
I think you're right.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's it's hospitals and education.
Yes.
In almost every sector. So a client comes to mind, the Little Sisters of the Poor. They are an order of Catholic sisters, more popularly known as nuns, but it's actually a misnomer because nuns are cloistered and the sisters are out there in the world doing work. An order
You
of
just taught me something. Good.
An order of religious sisters whose entire charism is dedicated to caring for the elderly poor. So all they do is have homes and medical facilities and health care for people who are elderly and poor.
Yeah.
And what they offer many times is a dignified end of life. Some of their residents are there for decades, and others are really, really at the end. So they're offering also a dignified death. And they were involved.
Back to inherent dignity.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were involved, sadly, in multiple Supreme Court cases because under the Affordable Care Act, one of the category of drugs that was mandated to be provided by insurers was all forms of FDA-approved birth control. And there is something like 20 or 21 of them. Now, there was a previous case to this that probably a lot of listeners may have heard of involving Hobby Lobby. And that was really about whether, the corporation, which was privately held, it's owned by a family, could object to 4 of those contraceptives because they felt that they were abortifacient. So they were happy to provide all of the other ones, 16 of them or something like that, but they didn't want their own insurance plan to cover 4 because they felt that they were abortifacient. They, in one case, the mechanism of the birth control was essentially to remove or make the uterus inhospitable to the fertilized egg so it could no longer grow. And that case was more about sort of, private action, how far religious freedom could extend to a privately held corporation. And in my mind and in Beckett's mind, that goes to collective action, to whether or not, a group of people should be able to use their religious freedom rather than just, individuals acting alone. And if you think about that, it makes sense relatively easily once you think about the fact that you can ask, does the New York Times have press freedom of the press? If they don't, they probably couldn't do what they're doing. And that's a corporation too, right?
Yes.
So there was that, but the Little Sisters actually objected to all of the contraceptives. And, to be fair, number one, they're celibate sisters. They don't really need it.
Yeah.
But beyond that, they do have people working for them who are not religious sisters and haven't taken vows of celibacy. And so this was under the Obama administration at the time, sort of said, no, you have to provide this. And not only that, we want you to sign on the dotted line to allow us to interact with your insurance company so that, we can make sure that there is this provision. And then that way you're not standing there handing out birth control. Fine, we agree you don't have to do that. But we want to use your insurance plan and we want you to sign this piece of paper. And the administration actually tried to argue that it was a meaningless piece of paper and is really not a substantial burden at all on their conscience rights. And I mean, when I think about this argument, I just think that's a little bit bonkers because if it's so meaningless, why do you need them to sign? And so there was a sort of real philosophical question there that was super interesting, which is at what point is the government going to accept that this is a degree of complicity with evil that we're going to respect? And in both of those cases, that test that I talked about earlier, the least restrictive means, came into play. So we won both of those cases at the Supreme Court. Hobby Lobby was a more divided court. Little Sisters was unanimous. But the government said, if you want to provide women, with free contraceptives, there's a less restrictive means to do this. Instead of going through Hobby Lobby's insurance plan, or instead of forcing the Little Sisters to be complicit in this, you can just give it away. So I think that that I think that case actually really illustrates how the little sister's whole life view is one thing. You cannot actually divorce their beliefs at one end of life from the other end. So they believe in the dignity of human persons from womb to tomb, from the beginning of life all the way until the end. And the Christian faith and the beliefs that they carry that enable them to dignify people who have no resources, nowhere else to go, are indigent, to dignify them. And I've been in their homes. They're not really that bare bones. They're beautiful places to live, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and they provide excellent medical care at the end of life. But what enables them to dignify somebody at the very end of life is intimately tied to what brings them to have their beliefs about the beginning. And their beliefs about the dignity of human beings from the very beginning of their life is absolutely what's informing their belief that human beings have complete dignity at the end, regardless of their capacities. A lot of people at their end of life are incapacitated. They lose one or more, mental or physical functions, and regardless of whether or not they have resources. So I don't think that you can divorce people's beliefs and say, well, why can't you bring this into the public square but not that?
Yes, and I hear you saying, Angela, that's one of the things that Beckett is doing, and why religious freedom is so important, because you go down a dangerous road when you're asking someone to divorce this little piece here with everything else they believe, and again, I think history shows that society unravels pretty fast. Say again as we wrap up here. Say again what you said earlier when you said, because that was to me that was so deep, where you said something about you show me how a society treats the least.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, show me any society, any jurisdiction, any country, and how they are treating the least among them. Right. So the least favored religious minority, the most disabled person, the person who has suffered sort of the most social pressures because of who they were born as. And I'll tell you how much justice they really have.
So here's the convicting part for me. I heard you say that, and I thought, for us as listeners, for me, for you, that applies to us as individuals, doesn't it, as well? You show me how I treat, or we treat, the least of these, and I'll probably it probably will display where my life really is. Which is, again, being people of faith. No wonder from cover to cover in the Bible, God's heart is for the least of these, and he tells us to care for the widows and the orphans and the least of these, because it does display where we are as individuals, as a family, as a culture, as a society.
So this is, I mean, you're bringing up something that's kind of become a passion of mine, and I'm still working through what that looks like in my personal life, in our life as a family. And that is that it's not just that we sit and we judge what's going on, right? And that or that we sit and we just try not to do harm. I actually think that we are called to do good, that we are called to be exceptional, to be, as a church, to be that city on the hill. And I see every day, I see ministers, I see missionaries, I see lay people, I see religious orders doing extraordinary things that really, really encourage me. And I also see us failing. So, in one, if you'll permit me to bring up the abortion context, I have very firm pro-life convictions, but something that I'm much more interested in than arguing about that, or even about when life begins, which I think is a really, really important discussion to have, is actually, what are we doing about helping mothers keep their babies? The vast, vast majority of abortion cases, I mean, we're talking 90+%, are for socioeconomic reasons. And shame on us. Shame on us that's why. Because the vast majority of these women would say, if I didn't have these certain social pressures, if my family was intact, if I had the economic resources, if I had any support in my life as a mother at all, with the 4 kids that are already overwhelming me, or even just with the first child, but I'm 16 years old, I would want to keep my child. And what are we doing to help them? So in every city we've lived in, we actually have found crisis pregnancy centers that provide, housing, healthcare, continued education. I mean, all of the things that I think are so not visible, especially in the mainstream media. And so the other side,
do care about life.
We do. There's a lot of that. Every place we've lived in, we found places like that. In our very modest way, found a way to help. But I sort of sometimes look at these places. I know that they're underfunded. I know that Planned Parenthood, which doesn't offer any of these things, gets many, many, many times more tax dollars for any of their programming. I know that there are waiting lists for many of these places. And the question is, why does it have to be like that? And I am talking to Christians to say, why are we not stepping up to do a lot more to take away the demand? But I sometimes say this also to friends of mine who are a great deal more morally liberal than I am, and who are pro-choice, to say, why are you not doing more? Why are we not agreeing on this? Let's keep arguing about the legality of abortion, right? We can have that civilized argument.
But what we should all agree on.
Why are we not agreeing on paid family leave? Why are we not agreeing on the fact that there are people who just need help for some period, and that we all receive that in some way? And I'm not just talking about government programs, because I've lived in DC long enough to work with the UN long enough, saw inside the belly of the beast with the government long enough to realize that there's incredible inefficiencies. And frankly, some of those programs do work really well. I believe in them. I believe in the people who are running them. And some of them really don't. It's full of waste. And the best programs that I've seen have been mostly privately run, oftentimes in partnership with public agencies. But sometimes they're just on their own. And it's because those programs are able to individualize. And a lot of times those programs are faith-based, because they're asking not just, what widget can I give you? What meal and how many can I deliver to you? But who are you as a human being? How can I dignify you as a human being? How can I accompany you in this journey with multivalent problems? And I started thinking about this honestly when I arrived at Beckett a lot more, because Seamus, our founder, created a workplace that was incredibly family friendly. I mean, so he has 7 children of his own. And I think he wanted to create a place where lawyers would stay as their families grew, instead of just get burned out and leave. Be a lawyer. Right. So, a living wage is very popular in the left and not so popular among conservatives. But let's own that phrase and say, if it's fair pay for actual labor, right? And to say we're going to have really great family leave for fathers and mothers, because you are not babysitting your children, you are fathering them when you're with them. And he also created the circumstances, and this is long before COVID-19 and remote work became popular, but he made it possible for women and men to be working remotely for part of their time, all of their time, if what they needed was to be home with their families. And it's enabled, I think, a disproportionate number of women to become senior lawyers in our firm, and to stay with their jobs even through multiple children. And that was and this is long before I think the conversation became popular, right? And it told me, whatever is out there and that people aren't getting, it is actually possible for us to do this. And it's not easy to negotiate, but I'm saying, why is not every Christian employer in the land setting the example for what that looks like? Because when your lawyer or your secretary or your administrative assistant walks into the room into their job, they're coming as a whole human being. It's not like they came in wearing just the one hat, right? So their expectations about performance, but they come with them, and your job as an employer is to enable their flourishing in life, Now, they might not be there forever. And some people are not cut out for certain jobs, right?
Yes,
The people get laid off, they get fired, they move on to other opportunities that are better fits for them, hopefully, is how we think of it when we have to let somebody go. But while they are in your employ, like why do we as Christians, and I think many Christians do, but we need to do this at scale. I just want the rest of the world to look at Christian institutions
as a model.
Yes, as a model, as a city on the hill, like, oh, there's another way to do this. Single women don't have to do this alone. Families don't have to totally crush us. We can be there's a way to be life-giving. There's a way to take care of the least among us.
Angela,
and still flourish, all of us, and make money even.
Yeah. It's interesting because this started, what you were saying here in the last moments started with me saying, going off of what you said about you show me a country where how they treat the least of these, and I'll show you how their justice system is. And I said, man, we need to apply that to ourselves. And I don't know if the listeners caught it. I bet they did. You came alive. Alive. But I love that. Well, we need to wind down here, but thank you so much for what you're doing. Thank you for the impact that you're having. I thank you just for what we learned today. I'm walking away. This is my truth that I'm taking as I walk away is it really matters how I treat the least of these. It really matters what I do with what I say I believe. If I say I'm pro-life, then I should be pro-life from the beginning to the end. How did you put it before?
From womb to tomb.
Womb to tomb. Yeah. And care about all of that. I'm caring about people, how people are living, the dignity. And so I'm walking away with that truth, and I appreciate that. One of the things that we do on here that's kind of fun, though, to finish is we do the 2 truths and a lie. So do you have 2 truths and a lie? It's ironic. Yeah. It's ironic. She's, for people that are listening and not watching, she's jotting some notes down. I'm not going to look at them because I have to try to guess this. 2 truths and a lie.
So Pete, when you had my husband on here, he's lived a more exciting life. I think he gave you some kind of hard to guess, right?
He was a logger. Yeah. He was inside a Russian camp, and
I know.
Okay.
Well, let me preface that by saying thank you, and also thank you for letting me be passionate. Mm-hmm. I hope it wasn't too much.
It wasn't too much.
And I'm grateful for our friendship because I feel like those relationships are going to keep us accountable, because it's not easy to do these things. I mean, we've had this very high-minded conversation, and I can tell you every day there's something that I kind of fall down on.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Okay, so 2 truths and a lie. I once was hiking for a month by myself in New Zealand and got lost on a mountain.
Okay.
I was in a horrible car accident in Bangladesh, and the only thing that saved me from going over a cliff was the fact that we hit a tree, and about 1 million villagers coming out in the middle of the night to help us. I had an amazing trip to Kenya, visiting some friends from law school, and climbed Kilimanjaro with them.
Ooh, those are good. Those are good. Middle one is true. The car wreck.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why so fast? Too many details?
Because you just shared some details that I was like, that's got to be true.
Oh, okay. I have to remember this for the next time we play this.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying not to encourage you to be a better liar. I'm just saying. So that one's true. And then I'm going to say the Kilimanjaro one you did not do.
You are cheating because you know that my husband is outdoorsman.
Yes, that's kind of true. Because right before we turned on the mics, we were talking, and you were saying I love to hike and everything, but other people have to kind of initiate. So that's where I figured it was.
Now, I was hiking in New Zealand.
Yeah, but you did. That one's true then. So,
I got lost.
You're a world traveler.
And so I have been to the foothills of Kilimanjaro and was there with friends. You just didn't hike up to the top. No, and it's kind of a lifelong dream to climb Kilimanjaro.
Pete will drag you.
So there's a little wish fulfillment in here too.
If your husband Pete drags you,
get him excited. He's never taken me up on it.
And there'll be some adventures. Anytime I'm with Pete, there's some adventures.
Well, he's traveled so much. I think he's tired of it.
Yeah, I think so. Well, Angela, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank
you
you.
for coming on as a guest.
Yeah, it was such a gift. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the No Gray Areas podcast. To dive deeper into the story, be sure to subscribe, follow us on social media, and check out nograyAreas.com.